Hey guys, it's Sloane. Thanks so much to everybody who tuned in yesterday to the first episode of my design diary. So today I'm here to talk a little bit about a new pullover that I have in the fall issue of Interweave Knits. Here's the fall issue. My pullover is called Great Island, which you can see in the photo. I wanted to talk a little bit about the inspiration behind this design and what we were thinking of when we came up with it, what the design brief was, and some particular things about using the yarn that we used for this sweater, which is called Woolfolk Tove. When a submission call comes out for a major magazine like Interweave, what they do is they post a mood board and they give you some guidance about what the themes are. And for this issue, Megan Babin, who's the editor of Interweave, was looking for really classic cabled sweaters. So there's nothing in many ways more classic for fall than a white cabled sweater. There's something about that kind of winter white shade that to me just screams knitting. So what I wanted to do was design something that would be speedy enough to knit in a heavy enough weight yarn that would be a relatively quick project for fall, but that would have cables that really, really shined and that you could see very well. I wanted it to have a lot of stitch definition. I wanted to choose a yarn that would have a lot of bounce and loft, but to design it in a way that would be flattering on the body. I love cables. I put cables everywhere, but I try to put cables in places where they're going to look good on your body and where they're not going to add a ton of bulk. If you've ever seen a true, traditional Aran sweater in the Aran Islands in Ireland, they're great sweaters. They tell us tremendous amounts about our knitting heritage. They're not really designed for ladies' bodies. They're designed for fishermen, which is great. But it means that when we use those elements in knitting and we want to put them on a modern woman's body in something that can go in your wardrobe and that you can wear to work or out to dinner with friends or on the weekend, you want to be a little more careful about where you put the cables so that you're getting a really flattering design for a woman's body. So here the form that took is that the bulk of the cables are actually on the back of the sweater. So as you can see from the photo, the back is cabled pretty much the entire width of the entire shoulder width of the sweater. So everywhere that you have stitches left after you've done your underarm bind off and after you've done your decreases. And then there's a little bit of stockinette at the sides. So again, we've concentrated cables on an area that most people don't mind adding a little extra fabric heft and weight. It also makes for a really neat reveal effect of, it looks like you're wearing kind of an ordinary sweater, and I think people often expect it to be plain on the back. And then you turn around and it has this very dramatic cabled effect, which I thought was neat and a neat element here. And then the front, we've concentrated cables below the V-neck in a narrower panel, so you still get that same cable detail, but it's not taking up the entire body, and in particular, it's not adding a lot of extra width and dimensionality like right at your hips or right at the side of your waist, which is a place that most people are not super psyched about adding lots of bulk. It's a little hard to see it in these photos, but the side seam actually tapers in a little bit. So if you make one with in a size with about 2 inches of positive ease at the bust, here they've modeled it with a little bit more ease, which is part of what happens in the publishing process. But if you make one with about 2 inches of ease, which is how this sample fits on me, the side seams taper in at the front, kind of like those cables on the front of Maple Shade, which makes for a really, really flattering look for the sweater. And it's a really subtle seam because we've just used mattress stitch and it doesn't scream attention to itself, but it just tapers in that split hem in the front just a little bit, which is a really nice slimming effect for most people. Here again, the V-neck depth is easy to adjust if the neck depth is a little bit deep for you. On most people, again, if you choose a size with about 2 to 4 inches of positive ease, you won't get quite as deep a neckline as it is on the model. I know they've styled it with a lot of shirt going on underneath the sweater, which is great. It definitely is a layering piece, but you don't need to be, I think, frightened that the neckline is super deep. You can also, if you want, you can make that actual neck band deeper if you end up with a sweater that you otherwise love the fit of, but you just want a little bit extra at that collar. I think it could look really nice with a little bit more neckline. I shared the swatch on Instagram the other day, and here it is. And this Woolfolk Tove is an Aran weight yarn, so again, it's got a lot of height and dimensionality, but when you block it, the cables flatten out quite a bit. So make sure that when you make your swatch, you make a big enough swatch that it's reflective of what your knitting is like when you knit a sweater. And also make sure that you pin it out when you block it to get a fabric that you're happy to have a whole sweater out of. So again, when you make a cabled swatch or you make part of a cabled sweater, the sweaters have, the fabric has a ton of bounce and three-dimensionality to it because those cables are kind of stacked on top of each other before it's blocked. When you block it, they relax out and it flattens out the fabric. So just make sure when you pin out your swatch, you're pinning it out to, a fabric that feels flat enough and has enough drape that you actually want it on your body. Because again, it's a sweater, it's not a desk ornament, it's going on your body, so it has to be a fabric that you feel really comfortable with. Part of what's really special about Tove is it's a cable spun yarn. So if I took these plies apart, and these have been blocked so it's a little harder to see, but you would see that what we have here are actually 8 plies that are made up of smaller strands of yarn that have been plied together. So that's a technique called a cable spin. There's a handful of yarns that have this property. If you've worked with the Snug series from Plucky Knitter, Woolfolk Tove and Tove DK, there's a couple of the Debbie Bliss yarns, there's a handful of Italian yarns that have this property, and it's a really, really neat spin to it. And it gives the yarn unbelievable stitch definition, but it still has a lot of lightness. Normally you don't get that kind of stitch definition from a traditionally spun yarn, unless it's quite round, which can make it a little bit heavier and a little denser. So here you get a lot of lightness and drape, and you get an incredible sheen and a lot of stitch definition. So I really liked that in this sweater. Again, because if you're gonna do this much knitting, you wanna be able to see it, and you want it to look beautiful in all kinds of settings and from a long way away. So this yarn gives you a great height and dimensionality to the cables, and a beautiful drape to the fabric, and a really lovely sheen, which really, I think, elevates the sophistication of the sweater and makes it something you could wear to work or wear, out to dinner on date night or whatever works in your closet. It was a really wonderful yarn, and it's special and soft and feels like you're knitting with angel butts. But because of that, it's a little bit fragile, right? Softer yarns tend to be more friable, they have shorter staple lengths, they have lower micron counts, which is what makes them soft and lovely, but also makes them a little bit more vulnerable than a harder wearing woolen spun yarn that was, for example, a Targhee or a Rambouillet or something with that's a little bit less of the finest fine wool on earth. That's okay, it's totally fine, and you can make sweaters out of these yarns that can last a long time. So I wanted to take a minute to talk about how I care for these sweaters. So as many of you know, I designed a sweater called Angwin last year, which was my sweater for Rhinebeck. And if you have been to a knitting show and run into me in the last year, you have seen me wearing it. You've probably seen me wearing it and sweating because it's been warm at a lot of those events. But I have worn it in a lot of what are really pretty high stress environments for a sweater. So I'm usually carrying a bag that's digging into my shoulder, and I'm wearing it over a pair of jeans with actual indigo dye, which don't do that with your white sweater, not a smart plan. And I'm walking around and people are touching me and it, and I'm in a field of sheep and whatever, and it's not, I'm not just being an indoor kitty with these sweaters. So that said, it's held up really, really well. So you'll see in the picture what it looked like just before I depilled it, and then I took a sweater shaver, which you'll see a little bit of the process, and now you can see how it looks after it's been cleaned up. So the cables are sharp again, there's still plenty of yarn underneath, and you can see in the close-up how much the yarn has rebounded from being shaved. So here's what the sweater looks like before. The last time I wore this was at Squam this year, because it was really cold in New Hampshire in the morning, and so that's a pretty, again, sort of rough on your sweaters environment. So I like to use a motorized shaver, which I'll tell you more about, but here's what it looks like just working on shaving down the cabled portions of the sweater. I like to use a sweater shaver rather than a gleaner or a sweater stone or what have you. I like to use the little motorized ones for cabled sweaters because you don't have to yank on the fabric as much. For the stockinette sections, a gleaner or a sweater stone or a sweater comb is totally fine, but I wouldn't do it on cables because you got to pull them out of shape a little bit. But if you use the little motorized shavers, all you have to do is run the shaver over there and it will pull the pills up. So that's a little more about my Great Island Pullover and where we were coming from and what the theory was with that sweater. So hit me up in the comments below if you have any questions, anything you'd like to hear me talk about in this space. You can also find me on Instagram and Ravelry at SK Rosenthal. on the web at SloaneRosenthalKnits.com or by email at hello@SloaneRosenthalKnits. Have a great week.